Continuing on from how the ark could have been built. At the ark encounter, answers in Genesis show how everything fits. Current estimates from the ark researchers place at least 1,398 animal kinds upon the ark. Now, each of these animal kinds and their basic needs like food and water and waste disposal has been accounted for in the layout of the ark. They would have needed 322,000 gallons of water for 12 months' need. They could have stored 95,000 gallons in storage vessels. They could have also been another 28,500 gallons in cisterns. And in rain capture, rain could have been collected from the colossal amount of roof space through gutters into cisterns quite easily. They would have needed something like 400 tons of food, grains and seeds and nuts, preserved fruits, vegetables, possibly even live insects. And 15,000 food storage vessels would have been needed. This is a huge operation. But of course, remember, none of the water animals would have needed to be in the ark, no aquatic animals. Obviously, they would have been just fine outside. No need to bring in dolphins and seals. And 85% of the animals in the ark would have weighed less than 22 pounds, 10 kilograms. 7% of the animals would have weighed anything between 22 pounds and 220 pounds, or between 10 and 100 kilograms. 8% of the animals would have weighed over 220 pounds, or 100 kilograms. So the ark is compatible with the Titanic, although it would have had much more floor space than the Titanic, actually, even though it wasn't as long as the Titanic. Compared to the Statue of Liberty, a 747 Boeing jet, much bigger. Considering how big the ark was, it could have fitted the equivalent of 447 tractor trailers, these kind of containers that we offload here for Litchfield, Africa. And so, considering these sort of size tractor trailers, that's the kind of storage space that would have been in the ark. And bearing in mind the size of the animals, no, we wouldn't have had to bring on a full-sized Tyrannosaurus Rex. Could have brought in young Tyrannosaurus Rexes and so on. He wouldn't have needed to have brought in the biggest examples of each species, although classically you always see a giraffe with the head sticking out the top of the ark. It looks good. But this gives you a bit of a feel of the daily provisions and how would you have been able to divide it up for 8 people to care for thousands of animals. Well, 8 people daily division labor, so 3 people cleaning cages, 1 person watering, 1 person feeding, and half a person, so to speak, shoveling waste from pit to pump, 1.5 people doing laundry, waste removal, maintenance, animal care, miscellaneous, another person dealing with human food and special diets for the animals. They would have needed at least 22 extra large cages, and for the big animals, like elephants, 186 large cages for example, lions and tigers, 293 medium cages, 308 bird cages or aviaries, 174 smaller cages, and about 415 amphibian cages. Now, of the clean animals, bear in mind that clean animals, there were 14 of each kind, and so looking at those, interesting, who would have had the proofreading job of all these different scientific animals? How did they determine the number of animals kinds? Well, several factors need to be considered. For example, splitting or lumping animals that may or may not be related as a kind. So coyotes, wolves, dingoes, domestic dogs can generally interbreed. So Noah might have just needed 2 of the dog kind on the ark. Well, likely there were a lot more, but all dogs come from common ancestors, and that includes coyotes and dingoes and so on. On the other hand, there's approximately 24 known families of bats, living and extinct. And based on anatomy and other features, many of these families probably belong to the same kind. It's possible that every bat belongs to the same kind. However, since breeding studies have not yet confirmed this, they split the bats into the various families. So instead of as few as 14 bats on the ark, they've now got 300 different bat species depicted as on the ark. In keeping with the worst case scenario to estimating the number of animals in the ark, the animals can be split into separate kinds whenever data is insufficient rather than lumping them into a single kind. So how many of each species or type of animal was there on the ark? Many people say 2. Well, actually, there were 14 of some of the animals. So when the Bible speaks of there being 7 kinds or 7 pairs of, the male and female. So Genesis 7 verse 2 speaks about 7, a male and his female. And so this indicates, because they came in 2 by 2, it must have been 14, because 7's an odd number. And they weren't always male and female all the way along. We could just comment on Genesis that God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, not Eve and Genevieve. It's plain from the very beginning. It's male and female, he made them. And today that's hate crime, thought crime, to suggest that there's only 2 genders. But it's normal for all of life, all animals. So they are seeing that, in fact, with the clean animals and so on, you could have had 7 pairs or 14. And I don't see much artwork showing that. Now he's brought to bring 2 of every unclean animal and 7 pairs of every flying creature and clean animal on board the ark. And so it's interesting, the Lord may have just simply said those 7 pairs each, and then wouldn't have had to know the distinction between them. Often you get depiction of there's Noah walking around and finding under this rock, and bringing the tortoise, carrying it to the ark and so on, and finding this parrot in a tree. But that's nice for the films, but the Bible says God sent the animals in. So Noah probably wasn't having to run around with a net catching butterflies and all of that, just often depicted. So they've got a model of how the ark could have easily been structured in the 3 layers and upper windows and so on. And so when you look at the design of the ark, you would have had for storage of food, for keeping of the animals, and there were a whole lot of innovations they looked at and saw this must be necessary. So, for example, they've got all manners of how to purify the water, how to purify the air, how to be able to harvest water, how to be able to feed the animals. They think there were at least something like 6,744 animals on the ark. And how they would have been structured and where they would have put them. And somebody worked through everything from, the mammals, living, flightless or guiders, the flightless birds like, of course, the ostrich and the emus, but they've got their scientific names here too, and the different birds and amphibians and reptiles. And the amphibians, most of us have never even thought of, let alone spelt many of the names of these different types of amphibians. And the different birds that are extinct now, but wouldn't have been at that time, and the reptiles that would have been extinct. So somebody put a lot of work and thought into this massive team. So how could they deliver enough drinking water for these over 6,000 animals? How could they remove animal waste, sustain fresh air, provide sufficient light? I mean, these are important practical questions. Well, so there's a series of different ways how they could have done this. How they could have been removing waste, and how they could have been ventilating the ark and providing fresh air, such as moon pools. I went onto the SA Agulhas some time ago and saw how they've got a moon pool literally in the middle of the Agulhas ship. They've got a place where you can either drop a submarine down under the vessel or resurface it, or divers could go down that way. And it's interesting because with the rising of the water up and down, it also sucks air in and out, and it serves as a ventilation for the ship. Well, they could have had the moon pool concept of wave-powered purifiers. So moon pools are generally used for drilling and research vessels like the SA Agulhas, but the same concept could be applied to exploit the waves to pump air throughout the ark. It may seem strange to include a shaft or well inside the ark that opens to the water below, but a moon pool would be an extremely effective mechanism to provide a continual supply of fresh air. And so the falling waves inside the moon pool pull in fresh air, and then the rising waves push the fresh air through the shaft even through to the bottom deck. And fresh air is directed to the lower level, ultimately bringing air to all the other ducts as well. So a wave-powered moon pool purifier could have easily been part of the design of the Ark. Simple, but effective. And this would have meant that they would have had, and of course they've got the windows at the top as well. There's a way of being able to have some ventilation throughout the Ark through this moon pool, falling waves, pulling in fresh air, rising waves, pushing the fresh air through the shafts of the bottom deck. Interesting technology. And so this is depicted as one of the possible features that the Ark had. The Ark could have also included a variety of ingenious methods to circulate air. For example, a furnace fueled by animal waste could have been used to heat the air and create a draft in a specially constructed flue in a chimney system. Another possibility is that people, animals, powered mechanical bellows or fans that could have been built to blow air through the Ark. And so they've considered convection. Many modern buildings that house large numbers of animals don't need any special mechanical system for ventilation. Instead, they're relying on natural convection currents to circulate air. In addition to possible opening along the roof, and which is specified that there's this window along the whole top of the Ark, sufficient airflow could have been produced by the temperature differences between cool surfaces in the Ark and the body heat generated by warm-blooded animals. How could the Ark have been lit? We've got 3 layers, but you've also got the top windows, which could have easily had sections that not only could light flow through, but you could lift up during time when it's not raining to get air flowing throughout much more effectively. And the Lord instructed Noah to make the ark's roof and to finish it to a cubit from the top, Genesis 6:16. Some translations mention a window in this context, but the normal Hebrew word for window is not used. The phrase may refer to a cubit high operating under the roof or some opening. So light could have spilled through the opening to light the whole ark from the roof down. That's a possibility. Sunlight through covering. Genesis 8:13 states that Noah removed the ark's covering as the earth dried near the end of their time in the ark. And the word used for covering refers to something other than the window. And Noah used the birds and the opening depicted in this illustration. The covering could have been a section roof that could have been drawn back to serve as a central skylight. So a central skylight could have easily been that you've got a covering like so, and by lifting it up, you can allow more, not just fresh air, but light. So you've got the options of the moon pools, you've got the options of the ventilation and lighting from the top, the wave-powered purifier. And then there's artificial lighting. They could have easily had a sunlight through opening, sunlight through covering. Artificial lighting could have been long-lasting fuel, olive oil, lamps inside, but they could have had other flames options, candles, torches could have been employed. Remember, torch in the old world was a big stick with some flammable liquid attached to the rag. It wasn't a battery-operated torch that we're talking about today. Through most of history, that's what people have understood by torch, a big flaming stick with a rag at the end. So that's why you see the ark depicted with this central gallery to provide light to spill all the way down to the lowest level of the decks through the central skylight at the top. And that can definitely work. That makes sense under the instructions that we read in Genesis, that they had a 1 cubit high opening at the top. And then when you look throughout this ark, you can see how the light can spill from top, but the ark could have provided sufficient food for thousands of species. There's a lot of storage space in a place that's as big as an aircraft carrier. And obviously there's sacks of grain. You would have had lots of that. Vessels containing everything from olive oil on. The different containers that they could have used at that time. You can imagine that they could have easily had delivery platforms to help feed the animals. So Noah's family may have used automated processes to handle many of the responsibilities for animal care. Food and water systems could have been used to contain several days' worth of nourishment, allowing creatures to eat and drink whenever they wanted. We've got this technology today. It uses just simple gravity. You fill from the top, but as they drink in the basin, it refills. We use this even for our pets today. They could have had refillable feeders where you walk on the catwalk above and you put more food down, and that might be sufficient for several days worth, that you don't have to be doing this every single day because you've got the feedable, the rechargeable feeders that are smart feeders to a large extent, but needs no serious technology. It's just working on basic gravity. And they would have had the ability to feed from above, and you've provided them with sufficient water, sufficient food as they need. Of course, many of the animals could have been put into hibernation. God could have done it, and we know animals that just naturally go into hibernation. So maybe they didn't need to feed the people as much, the animals as much as every day either, if some of the creatures went into hibernation. God could have even put many of them into hibernation that wouldn't normally do so. So how could Noah's family tend to thousands of animals? Well, workable models, manageable workloads, providing for such a diverse assembly of creatures would have involved a lot of work, but probably, if you calculate it, the average family member would need to have been caring for about 850 animals, if you divide between the 8 humans. And 850 animals per person, but the use of smart feeders and division of labor, thinking this out, could easily have reduced the workload. So here you've got, for small creatures, small caves, and you've got, again, this what do we call it, where they reload each time. As you empty out the bowl, more will come in. And in that way, animals could have been fed on several days or weeks without needing a recharging of the food. So the other thing is, how do you care for a lot of reptiles and amphibians? Well, there's also the moths who multiply, and finding some of these flying, crawling insects that can ongoing breed. So you could have central cribs housing moths which climb into pots and become a source of food. So if you've got your chameleons over here, for example, and you've got your moths breeding here, and sometimes they come through and provide a future meal for these creatures. You can imagine here's this little mouse, and he's got his water vessel and his food container, which again, it's a smart feeder. It doesn't require daily maintenance. To get a bit of an idea of how they could have structured a whole lot of these. What do you do with the picky eaters who've got specialized diets like koala bears and fruit bats and ant eaters? Well, ant eaters thrive on eating ants, and they can devour 35,000 insects a day. That's pretty hard to deal with. But ant eaters in captivity can be fed fruit and eggs. And in the wild, giant ant eaters also consume fruit that's dropped to the ground, rotting fruit. And the other anteater species can climb trees to get food. So they didn't have to be fed necessarily insects. Koalas can eat the leaves of other trees. Yes, we know they like eucalyptus, but it's possible that you could feed them on other things as well. And the koalas were less specialized possibly back then, and probably heartier than modern representatives. So they might have eaten a wider variety of food, including grains, fruits, and vegetables back then. How could the ark have provided sufficient water for the thousands of species? Well, collecting water from the roof, filling cisterns, and having those cisterns to be able to refill the different cisterns leading into the different cages could have easily been done. The roof has a vast area that could capture, harvest a lot of rainwater, and then with a whole lot of strategically placed storage tanks and a system of spigots and bamboo and even possibly copper pipes could have delivered water throughout the ark. Due to the surface area of the ark's roof, 1 inch of rainfall a week could have kept all the cisterns full. Just an inch of rainfall a week, which is not much. And it rained like 40 days and 40 nights. So they would have had no shortage of water. And you can imagine how these spigots could just sufficiently refill, recharge as needed. And that's old technology. This existed for quite a while. So you've got your smart feeders. Now, what about droppings? Well, slotted floors and cages combined with a series of angled trays placed beneath them could remove the waste of many animals to a collection tray at the bottom of the stack that could be quickly cleaned in this kind of way, so that they could keep the place clean, keep the air clean, keep moving waste out, and keep, here we've got an elephant helping with a treadmill to keep things flowing and pumping. And it's possible a lot of this could have been moved by wheelbarrows, buckets, pulley systems. So these are just some, even an elephant on a treadmill to be able to give him exercise and move things around as needed. So what about Noah's family? And why are the living quarters so nice? And illustrations of Noah's Ark really give consideration to living arrangements for the family, but they could have had just the bare necessities, but it's more likely they would take more care in building their rooms, because as far as we know, the Lord didn't inform Noah how long they'd need to be on the ark, so they should have been prepared for an extended time on the ark. And they were obviously hard-working, especially caring for all those animals each day. This isn't like a pleasure cruise, it's a hard-working cruise. So having a comfortable place to relax and refresh would be extremely beneficial to keep up morale and energy. Imagine 1 year caring for hundreds of animals. That's a lot of work. And so it's understandable they would have had nice living quarters, and they had the technology. If they could build an ark like that, they could have certainly made comfortable living quarters. They would have had the musical instruments. They would have been writing, painting, creating, involved in a variety of skilled activities, because these were intelligent people to build the ark, and they were obviously industrious and hardworking. So you can imagine the kitchen would have been intriguing. There would have quite a variety of things to be preparing for themselves and for the animals. They would have probably had cooking facilities like this on board the ark, and you can imagine the vegetable sections. The pantry would have been a phenomenal pantry on the ark, just for the human food needs, amongst other things. And so some of the tools and some of the type of pottery and plates that we can imagine they would have used, all being depicted on Noah's Ark, as well as hammocks, which in a stormy sea can be a pleasant way of rocking yourself to sleep. And you can imagine they could have had all kinds of boxes and working areas and trunks and cupboards. All of this is very feasible and realistic, considering what Noah's Ark would have been like and what the quarters would have been for their people, also making use of space and drop down shelves inside the cupboards and so on. You're dealing with some of the most advanced woodworkers and architects in history. You can imagine they would have been able to make some very comfortable living quarters. There would have been a lot of industry going on, weaving. You can imagine what they could have been producing while they're in the ark, when they had time to. And of course, you would have had birds sometimes out of the cage flying around. They wouldn't have kept them all confined the whole time. Maybe some of the animals were sometimes taken for walks outside the cages, up and down. And it could have been quite an extraordinary situation. Now, comparisons with other flood narratives in different cultures around the world, there are post-flood world stories and Babel and evidences for worldwide flood and much more, so that there's so many different theories and stories, legends of the flood. And it seems like every culture and civilization in the world has a legend of a global flood and a boat and 8 people, and about 200 legends around the world of how animals and people survived the flood. And so critics of the Bible often claim that the biblical flood account is copied from ancient Babylonian or Sumerian flood legends, since these writings predate the time of Moses. But it makes more sense to believe the biblical account reveals the true history of the flood, while legends tell a distorted view of the same event. So, for example, just looking at these legends, the Mayans have this big canoe. Well, it's hard to imagine a big canoe being big enough for all the animals in the world and surviving the trauma of the flood. The Incas have some large raft. Well, it's hard to imagine a large raft managing the amount of animals and food and surviving a year in the flood. The Arawaks also kind of canoe. Montagnus, also speaking about some kind of canoe. The Norse have a big open boat. Well, again, how's it going to be big enough for all the animals, and how's it going to survive the trauma of the flood? The Greeks had some kind of squared rectangular box, and the Aztecs had a larger canoe. Again, amongst the Maitaso, some kind of junk. And all of these, whether you talk about the Maasais, the Rukwa, open boats, almost all of them. Hawaii has a raft, catamaran type sailing vessel. Again, none of these could actually accommodate all the animals and the people, nor Fiji. And so there's no tree large enough to hold all people and animals. A canoe would quickly be swamped in a flood. And so all of these different models fail. By the way, we've got this model downstairs in the boardroom. It's the model of the Ark from the Ark Encounter. You've also got those who believe, like Gilgamesh, a large box, or this large round circle, the coracle Acadanian, which, how would that survive and how would that fit all the animals? And they would get super dizzy spinning around there. You can imagine how this would spin in the water, and everyone would be terribly seasick. So none of these models work. None of these models could survive either the ocean during a flood, nor could they accommodate all the animals needed. So, a double raft, people, animal supplies would be washed overboard. The raft would break apart. If it's large enough for people, animals, and supplies, it would break under the stresses of the waves and the wind. So, and this one, honestly, this would just tumble. So everyone would be upside down, back. So that's got no stability. Gilgamesh is one of the more unworkable of all of them. But these are different flood legends. Now, the Bible is specifically speaking about a model that is sustainable, which is workable. And so, since the Bible is God's word, it's accurate in all it records. It's not just limited to matters of faith. The Bible is accurate in everything it deals with. Only the dimensions of the biblical ark provide the ideal size and strength and stability and comfort for a ship built to protect people and animals during a flood. And so they've got the different models, sink or swim, which ark would survive the global flood. They've got the different options, and you can see, all of these models, there'd be no survivors, because first big wave and there would go your caracal or your raft and your canoe and what have you. But the ark has the dimensions and the size and the proportion, the stability to protect its passengers from destruction, which a cataclysmic event like the flood would be. And Noah and his family, along with all the animals, went out of the ark in safety. Proof that it worked. And a rainbow has been associated with the ark ever since. So, you look at the different types of animals that you might have had all the dogs in the world descended from a dog looking like that, roughly. And again, all the different types of ape species from a chimpanzee-like creature looking like this, and so on. There's some evolution within species, but there's no evolution between species. And so you do see adaptations and changes within species, but you don't see any species turning into another species. So there's also looking at the different ark books and models that you see in Sunday schools, which often don't look scientific, don't look believable, and while they might look cute, they're not communicating the scientific seriousness of what Genesis is reporting. And so, unfortunately, there's a whole generation that's been raised on unbelievable little stories, which makes it very hard for those youngsters after Sunday school growing up to take the Bible seriously as scientifically credible. If I can convince you that the flood was not real, I can convince you heaven and hell are not real either. And so some of these, which look cute, are not actually helping. And that's why having a more realistic view of the ark, including that dinosaurs are climbing onto the ark too, because dinosaurs and people lived at the same time. Of course, they didn't have to be the biggest Diplodorus and Tyrannosaurus Rex. There could have been smaller versions, but still, they could have all fitted on there too. So there's also the Rainbow Covenant. And God made his covenant with all the creatures of the earth that he wouldn't send another flood again. In the year 2000, when they were opening up the waterfront with the Two Oceans Aquarium, there's a big billboard around Cape Town that was saying, "Come see the animals that Noah forgot." And my daughter Andrea, who was only 9 years old at the time, said, "Well, that's silly. Noah didn't forget any animals because all the sea creatures didn't need to go in the ark," which is totally true. If it was obvious to a 9-year-old, why is it not obvious to the adults? But yes, obviously Noah's ark didn't need to take aquatic sea creatures, and they didn't need an ark anyway. They're safer in the water than they are inside some boat. And all of these magnificent sea creatures, of course, while they would have got tumbled around a bit in the flood, they would have survived just fine. And Noah didn't forget any animals. So the ark encounters a great place. And the catastrophe of the flood is critical to understanding our world today. Ken Ham has said that his interest in the flood and the ark was intensified when he read the book, The Genesis Flood, by Dr. Henry Morris and Dr. John Whitcomb, which we've got downstairs, part of our library and our bookshop. The catastrophic event of the flood explains why most of the fossil record, and it's integral to a fuller understanding of the topic of origins. So you can imagine that a lot of the animals that we see in fossilized form, they came from the flood. The Creation Museum opened in 2007. It's got a spectacular Noah's Ark exhibit, become very popular for museum visitors. But the massive exhibit represent only 1% of the Ark's volume. So in 2004, the leadership team at Answers in Genesis began to put together a strategic plan to build a life-sized Noah's Ark after the museum's completion. And from the beginning, Ken Ham envisaged a museum highlighting the 7 C's in God's eternal plan: creation, corruption, catastrophe, confusion, Christ, cross, consummation. And a lot of that's in Genesis. Creation, corruption, the fall, catastrophe, the flood, confusion, Tower of Babel. But even there are early symbols and pointers to Christ being the seed of the woman, Isaac's sacrifice, and so on. So, Jacob's ladder. So, there are some hints of the cross coming and pointing towards consummation, which we get in the rest of the Bible. And so you can see in the Creation Museum a lot of the following the 7 C's and giving us a sweep of history and where creation, the global flood, fits into this vital understanding of world history. So the 7 C's in God's eternal plan. In the beginning, in 6 24-hour days, God made a perfect creation. But the first man, Adam, disobeyed the Creator, and he brought death and corruption into creation. The catastrophe, Adam's race became so wicked that God judged the earth with a global catastrophe, the flood, saving only those on the ark which had been built by Noah. In the confusion when Noah's descendants disobeyed God's command to fill the earth, God brought confusion on their language and caused them to spread over all the earth. The Creator became a man in the person of Jesus Christ, who obeyed God in everything, unlike the first man, Adam. So Christ was in many ways the second Adam, recreation. Jesus the Messiah died on the cross to pay for the penalty of mankind's sin against God. He rose from dead. He provides eternal life for all who trust in him. And all of history is heading towards the consummation when God will create a new heaven and a new earth. And he'll destroy death, and he will cast out the disobedient and dwell eternally with those who trust in him. So inspired by Colossians 3 verse 23, whatever you do, do it heartily as unto the Lord and not to men. Answers in Genesis believe that the museum and exhibits must be as good as and better than what secular world offers. We have the greatest message, we have the most important message in the universe to proclaim the gospel. And so the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter are built with excellence in mind. And Ken Ham explained to our mission that the Ark Encounter consists of exhibits within an exhibit. So the massive Ark itself is an exhibit, and inside the wooden structure another 132 exhibits containing stunning teaching. The Ark is the biggest wooden structure in the world today. It's a jaw-dropping experience. God created wood, and there's something about wood, especially with the enormous amount of wood seen inside the Ark, that absolutely fascinates people. We don't tend to see so much built with wood these days. They love the look and the feel of it. Guests often stop and contemplate the massive beams and the craftsmanship that went into building of the Ark structure. The Ark Encounter is an evangelistic ark. It will be one of the greatest Christian outreaches of our era. It is all part of our occupying until he comes. In fact, the Ark Encounter can have 1 million people a year coming to visit it. It's one of the greatest theme parks in all of North America. As you visit the Ark Encounter and gaze at what some are calling a new wonder of the modern world, I urge you to ponder Genesis 6 verse 22. Thus Noah did. According to all that God commanded him, so he did. It's no wonder that Noah is listed in the Believers' Hall of Fame in Hebrews 11. May we be bold men of faith just like Noah. And to go to the Ark Encounter is phenomenal. They allowed me in early. I got in before any of the guests. That's why I've got quite a few pictures without any people in them, because I was privileged to get there before anyone else. Got the journalist pass to be able to get pictures. They've got a lovely petting zoo option where a whole lot of fun creatures are. Again, there's nothing like interacting with many of the animals that would have been on Noah's Ark, and be able to interact with them to understand what God called Noah to do, to bring representatives of all these animals and to preserve both animals and people from the worldwide catastrophe. They also have the largest zip line structure in the whole of North America. Now, I didn't manage to go on this because it would have taken 2.5 hours just to do part of it. You can spend 4.5 hours taking all the zip lines around the valleys around them. And I didn't have that much time. I thought I was there for several days, but I just needed to see every exhibit, and it took that much time. But people come there just for the zip line, and they end up going in such real evangelistic outreach in many ways. So what's the real purpose of the ark? Other than the cross, the ark is the greatest reminder of the message of salvation. Noah had to place one door in the ark, and only those who went through that door were saved from the watery judgment. God's Son came into history to become Jesus Christ, the door, the God-man. And just as Noah and his family went through the ark's only door to be saved, so we need to go through the one door. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, Jesus said, he will be saved and will go in and out and will find pasture. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So Ken Ham also observed to Frontline Fellowship, as we look at the decline of Western culture today, Christians will notice many similarities to the wicked days of Noah. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. I mean, think Hollywood. Think of the debauchery going on in so much of the world. So Ken Ham said, we've built this ark to remind people that God is a righteous God who judges wickedness. But just as God provided salvation to Noah and his family, God has provided an ark of salvation for us today. Through Christ's atoning death on the cross of Calvary and his glorious resurrection, God has provided for our salvation. One door, one way. And each of us needs to go through the door of the cross of the Lord Jesus Christ to be in his ark of salvation. And our Lord was crucified, and after that there was a large stone like a door rolled over his tomb, and that door was opened when Christ rose from the dead. And so you think of the Passover lamb, and you think of the blood on each doorpost and above the doorpost, which is almost the sign of the cross, reminding us that Jesus is our Passover lamb. And where do we stand concerning God's free gift of salvation in Christ? The Ark Encounter is the newest, most visible ministry outreach of Answers in Genesis. It was founded in 1994 by Ken Ham, Mark Loy, and Mike Zoveth. Answers in Genesis is headquartered in the Creation Museum near Cincinnati in Petersburg, Kentucky. In more than 23 years, Answers in Genesis has grown to include more than 600 full-time employees, and it's the largest apologetics Bible defending ministry in the world. And our bookshop downstairs is the African distribution point for Answers in Genesis. So you can get any Answers in Genesis materials through here. The Ark Encounter was officially opened the 7th of July, 2016, 7/7, to coincide with Genesis 7, verse 7. Apparently Ken Ham puts his staff and construction people into heart-stopping shock when he said this has got to be ready by the 7th of the 7th. And they're like, it's 4 months ahead. Well, anyway, they did it. So Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives went to the ark because of the waters of the flood. Genesis 7, verse 7. Having spent 2 days carefully examining every exhibit on the Ark Encounter, I've got no doubt that you can learn more from a thorough exploration of the Ark and the flood of Noah than most students could learn in a month or maybe even a year in the average classroom. It's an absolute must for home educators and Bible students. And we can actually benefit with a lot of the videos and a lot of the books. And there's some phenomenal ones down there. And just in the restaurant, they've got some of these artworks of different ones of God's creatures that have been donated to them that are part of celebrating God's magnificent creatures, all of which descend from animals who went into the ark. And so you just think of all the magnificent animals of the world. If any of them had been left behind, they wouldn't be around today. And the ark is the clear reminder God provided one way of salvation in the flood, and he's providing one way of salvation today. So this is all super important, highly inspiring, and it should put in us a love for God, an appreciation of our salvation, and also an appreciation for the animals. Because if this was all about man, Noah would have just had to provide for some sheep and goats and cattle and horses, domestic animals. But the fact that God wanted thousands of species of animals provided for shows God prizes creation. Whether they're of practical use to humans or not is irrelevant. They're God's creation, and all animals are God's animals, and we're responsible as stewards of God's creation. So I think that the ark should remind us that animals matter. I've had some people say, let me throw out some nice controversial thing, that no animals are as important as people. In fact, they said all the animals in the world aren't as valuable as one human life. To which I've got to say, well, what do you say about Noah's Ark? Because there were 8 people and thousands of animals inside the ark who were saved. There were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people outside who God counted less valuable than the animals and people in the ark. So the redeemed of God and the chosen animals of God were chosen for salvation. And the rest of mankind were condemned to destruction because of their wickedness. Now, you cannot say that all the animals of the earth are worth less than one person, considering the fact that God in the flood showed that his priorities were very different from ours. God's ways are not our ways, and God's thoughts are not our thoughts. And of course, to a humanist, they don't want to believe that any human being deserves death, let alone eternal judgment. And they don't even want the death penalty for murderers, although they do want death penalty for babies unwanted through abortion. That kind of death they support. So you can just see the inconsistency of the humans, but they want to say, our lives are valuable and precious. Although, babies' lives don't matter and things like that. But their attitude is so selfish and materialistic. But then you get the ark, and God saves 8 people, thousands of animals, and condemns millions of people. That's not a nice message. I mean, that's a message that God is a holy God, he's a righteous God, and he will judge wickedness. But he will provide salvation, but there's only one way. There's one door, and that's the one we've got to go through for salvation.